Hello, um, welcome to the first of hopefully what is many podcasts. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper um, into our Unit 2 studies in this podcast, and we're going to be looking at the extent of Sovietisation in what became German Democratic Republic, East Germany. So in lessons we've had a little look at Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and we've seen Sovietisation had occurred to varying degrees in those countries. But in this podcast, we're going to have a closer look at the situation in East Germany. So let's go back to 1945 to the Yalta and Potsdam peace conferences, the first real meetings of the Big Three: Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, respectively. Yalta in February 1945, and then Potsdam in the wake of the German surrender. Truman, Stalin, originally Winston Churchill, then of course the Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee. So Germany was dismembered under the terms of the agreements of both peace conferences. And as we know, Germany was divided up into 4 zones of occupation: an American zone, a British zone, a French zone, and of course a Soviet zone. And it was also agreed at Yalta and then rubber stamped at Potsdam that Berlin would also be divided into 4 separate zones of occupation. Obviously, Berlin was the capital, and the Allies felt it was important that they had a shared zone of occupation in the German capital. Now, of course, this would cause big problems in the future, because Berlin was deep in the Russian zone of occupation. From Potsdam onwards, so from July 1945, it became clear that there was significant tension between President Truman and Stalin over the future of Germany. Even at such an early stage, the Western Allies could see the folly of a weakened communist Germany that would be little more than an instrument of Moscow. So by 1947, the relationship between the occupying powers was breaking down, and the Western zones of occupation were first of all formed into a mutual British and American zone called Bizonia. That was then merged with the French zone to become Trizonia. And in the wake of the Berlin blockade of 1948, and that was though the Western zones of occupation formally became West Germany, the Federal Republic of West Germany, under the leadership of Konrad Adenauer in May of 1949. And so the Soviet zone followed suit, and that was formally reorganized into what became the GDR, the German Democratic Republic. Now, Stalin only ever saw the partition of Germany, the dismemberment of Germany, as a temporary measure. He envisaged a unified Germany that would be severely economically weakened through reparations and the relocation of industry to the Soviet Union. So he envisaged a united Germany in which the Soviet Union would have all of the spoils, that would be kept weak under a communist government that would be very closely aligned to the model in Moscow. But of course that didn't happen. By 1948, Stalin was forced to try to force the Western powers out of Berlin when they introduced a West German currency into their respective zones of Berlin, and that prompted the Berlin blockade of 1948, which lasted from June 1948 to May of 1949, and it involved a significant Allied airlift, planes taking off every minute, landing at Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin to keep West Berlin, supplied, particularly during the winter months in what was a very severe winter. So Stalin called off the blockade, and it was a failure. He had failed to eradicate the West, or to force the West out of West Berlin. And very quickly, what happened was the Western powers realized that West Berlin would become a symbol of freedom behind the Iron Curtain. It could become a showcase for Western capitalism. So and it was very much an artificial construct, an artificial entity, but they spent a lot of money making sure that West Berlin was this sort of island of freedom deep inside the Iron Curtain, and it could become a showcase for Western capitalism. So the Soviets and of course to the East German leadership, West Berlin was an embarrassment. So there's a little bit of the background with regards to the GDR. Now, Stalin used the same methodology to ensure that a communist government was in power in East Germany, as he had done in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and all the other satellite states. So what happened is that the KPD, which was the German Communist Party, along with the SPD, which was the Social Democratic Party, both parties had been widely supported. Prior to the Nazis coming to power in 1933, they had gone underground during the era of the Third Reich of Nazi Germany, but they'd re-emerged after the war, and the KPD and the SPD was brought together and reframed as the SED, the Socialist Unity Party. So the GDR was formally established in October 1949 as a response to the Western zones of occupation being reformed into the Federal Republic of West Germany. Now, the first General Secretary of the GDR was Wilhelm Pieck and Otto Grotwell, but always manoeuvring in the background was Walter Ulbricht, who would become the officially the General Secretary in 1950, and he was in that position until 1971. So Ulbricht was a key figure, always in the background, very much a loyal Stalinist, and he was key to the development of the GDR, even though ostensibly Wilhelm Pieck was the first General Secretary. But I would suggest that Walter Ulbricht was very much the conductor, if you will, of the GDR. Now, his position was not always secure, and it was, I guess, really the events of the East German uprising in Berlin in June of 1953. In the wake of that, Ulbricht was able to exercise some political muscle to really rubber stamp his authority on the GDR. So, with regards to political organisation, um, the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, was, as you would expect, it was modelled very much on the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. As we've seen before, particularly in Poland, there was an illusion of democracy, of a multi-party democracy. So the legislature of the GDR, the Volkskammer, was made up of elected representatives from multiple different parties. But, and here's the caveat, these parties, of course, had to toe the line. They had to give the full support to the SED. They had to vote as the SED directed them to. So what you have, of course, is the appearance of a multi-party system, but it's all fundamentally controlled by the SED. So again, as we've seen, it makes the process of Sovietisation a little bit more palatable. Now, let's not forget this. The East German people are a people under occupation. The population of East Germany really suffered as the Red Army, of course, invaded at the very end of World War II. Many East German women were raped by Soviet soldiers, and that went on for quite some time. So Germany's very much, but the eastern zone of Germany at least was very much, a defeated power. It was under Soviet occupation, and so the process of Sovietization had to be at least had to have the appearance of democracy. Now, in the wake of the uprising of 1953, which we're going to get to in a moment, Walter Ulbricht initiated a major purge of the SED leadership. And again, this is a theme that we have seen in the satellite states, in Poland, but most certainly in Czechoslovakia. So in the aftermath of the unrest, around 60% of the SED membership were purged and forced out of the party by 1954. And of course, this was the very opposite of what had happened. So, for example, in Poland in 1956, the uprising had brought Gomulka back into power, who believed that Poland had its own path to socialism. So he had a more reformist tendency. The opposite is the case in the GDR. So what happens as a result of these purges is that anyone with reformist tendencies was purged from the party. Now, so with regards to political organisation, then there was a high degree of Sovietisation, and politically, the SED was modelled completely on the CPSU. The party was centred around an idea of what is called democratic centralism, but that's not democracy as we would understand that. That means in this context that there was a clear chain of authority, okay, which was very much based on Marxist, Leninist theory. There was a central committee, there was a Politburo, so it was very much based on the Soviet model. Now, with regards to economic organisation, again, if we go back briefly to Germany under National Socialism, agriculture was a big part of of Nazi economic policy, a big part of Germany becoming or achieving autarky or economic self-sufficiency. So that being said, what we call East Germany at this point in time was still largely agricultural. So true to the Soviet model, there was a massive emphasis on 5-year plans and industrialization. Now, this was not as straightforward as perhaps it was in the other satellite states. Again, we come back to this theme. Germany is a country, or East Germany is a country under Soviet occupation. And the USSR had demanded 25% of industrial products in the GDR as reparations for the damage accrued during the war through the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Soviets also dismantled many East German industries and industrial plants and relocated them back in the Soviet Union. Industrialization was further made more complicated by the fact that East German industry had, by and large, always had its supplies of coal and steel from the Ruhr, the industrial area of Germany, which was now, of course, in what had been the British zone of occupation, which was now in West Germany. And as some of you might recall, the economic position of the GDR becomes increasingly fragile through the 1950s as a result of the mass exodus of East German workers to West Germany. And the use of the term exodus is quite appropriate. Now, what was happening, of course, was that huge amounts of East Germans, particularly young East Germans, particularly talented, well-educated East Germans, were leaving the GDR through the open border in Berlin. So as I said at the beginning of this podcast, after the failure of the blockade in 1948, the West put a huge amount of money and resources into building West Berlin into this flagship of Western capitalism. And so, East Germans could travel freely to East Berlin, cross the open border into the western zone of Berlin, where they could have a taste of life in the West, and they liked it, and they were able to leave the GDR from West Berlin to West Germany. So by 1960, around 200,000 East German citizens had left the GDR to be welcomed into West Germany as refugees, and the West German government was more than happy to accept them because it was a great propaganda victory. Now, of course, at this point, West Germany doesn't recognize the existence of East Germany, so the two states were kind of loggerheads. So the West German government was more than happy to accept hundreds of thousands of East German refugees. In the first half of 1961 alone, there were 150,000 East Germans fleeing East Germany via Berlin to West Germany. So, of course, that's what prompted the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961 to not just close the border, but to seal it off entirely. Once that happens, the GDR is able to establish itself as probably one of the more prosperous and powerful economies of the satellite states. But it was in a very, very vulnerable position until the border in Berlin was closed and the wall went up. And I will be doing a future podcast on the building of the Berlin Wall, certainly at some point before Christmas. So what you have in the GDR, of course, is, as you have in the Soviet Union, as you have in the other satellite states, you have a high degree of central planning. So, as you'd expect, all industries were nationalised. In other words, they were taken over by the state. There were respective 5-year plans launched. The 1950 plan promised to double the output of 1936. There was a massive emphasis on heavy industry. By the way, the plan, the 5-year plan of 1936, was the 5-year plan put together by Hitler and Goring. So what they're effectively saying is that the 5-year planning in the socialist side of Germany was going to be far in excess of that of the Nazi regime. So statistics and figures would tend to show that by the 1960s, I mean, particularly after the war went up, the GDR economy was growing around about 3% a year. Again, that varies depending on the sources of information that you're looking at. Now, of course, this was below the West German economy, which was growing on average around 8% a year. Now, in 1959, Albrecht promises a new 7-year plan, which he said that certainly by 1961 the GDR economy would be overtaking the economy of the FRG, the Federal Republic of West Germany. That was a very, very bold claim to make, particularly when what he's talking about is a higher per capita, that means per person, consumption of foodstuffs and consumer goods. So there was a promise that the East German economy was going to raise the standard of living, not just on a parity with the West German economy, but would be higher than the West German economy. Now, this was partially achieved by a new economic system that was brought in 1963. Now, what this did, as we've seen in a similar story in some of the other satellite states, it particularly in Poland, it permitted some degree of decentralization. There was greater decision-making powers conferred on managers. There was a shift away from the emphasis on quantity and more of an emphasis on quality of goods, which of course is absolutely essential if you're trying to improve standards of living. And as we go through the course, we're going to see the degree to which that was successful. But certainly, by the mid-1960s, the GDR does appear to be one of the more prosperous and successful of the satellite state economy. But as we'll see later on in the course, it was achieved at a considerable price, and it stores up significant problems for the future. So all of this served, of course, to ensure that the GDR was, as a political entity, was significantly stabilized by 1964, particularly in the wake of the building of the Berlin Wall and the closure and the sealing in of the former open border in Berlin. Now, some mention also has to be made of the fact that out of all the satellite states, the East German regime, the GDR, had, without a doubt, the most feared and repressive of all the secret police apparatus. So the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, was set up formally in 1950. It came out of a lot of pre-existing security organizations in East Germany going back many, many years. It would be headed by Erich Mielke for a considerable amount of time. This guy was absolutely ruthless. And the Stasi were, as I say, the most probably feared instrument of terror and state surveillance in the communist bloc. Now, so we'll get into the Stasi in far more detail in a future podcast, in the future lessons, of course. But they were really the glue that held the GDR together. It's now, it's now estimated that around 1/3 of the East German population was under some form of surveillance by the Stasi, by the Ministry of State Security. So the GDR very quickly became a police state. There's no other word to describe it. It was a police state. It wasn't a workers' paradise. There was no true path to socialism. The East German state was never going to wither away. According to Marxist Leninist ideology, and the Stasi became the ultimate instrument of terror in this East German police state. So it was a state based around a constant state of surveillance. As you're going to see later on, of course, the Stasi their methods included intercepting letters, tapping telephone conversations, bugging houses, hotel rooms, schools, universities, hospitals, public places, places of worship. Didn't matter where, they were listening to you. If you were a suspected enemy of the state, your every movement would be under constant surveillance. When you were out at work, they would break into your house. You wouldn't know that they'd done it. And they had a technique called decomposition. And this was part of a psychological war against suspected dissidents. And what they did was quite simple. Because you were under surveillance, they were listening to you, there were bugs in your house, they were recording your conversations in your leisure time with your family, they would break into your house when you were at work, and they would just move things around, little objects. And so you'd come home and, the people under surveillance would realize, well, I didn't leave it there, I put it over there. And so gradually people would think they were going mad. And that policy was called decomposition. It was psychological torture and harassment. And amongst all those other techniques, of course, they would arrest you. And once they built up enough evidence that you were engaged in activity that was harmful to the state and to the party, you could be arrested. And they used torture and various other techniques to break you down. And oftentimes, like the KGB in the Soviet Union, they would give you a good beating and they would throw you against the cell walls. But of course, the cell walls were lined with soft material, hence soft cells. So there wouldn't be any visible marks of a physical beating on your person. So it was a significant instrument of terror. Again, very much based on the KGB and the Soviet Union as part of this overall policy of Sovietisation. Unlike the Nazi Gestapo, which was only around for 12 years, the Stasi, of course, would endure right away to 1989. And they were able to utilize the latest developments in technology in order to keep, better check of any potential dissidents. So let's just have a look before we finish at the East German uprising of June 1953. So I've already said, talked about the importance of the building of the Berlin Wall as securing the regime. Now, the East German Rising of 1953 is probably the least known of all the uprisings in Germany. Well, I say the uprising, of course, everyone knows about the Berlin blockade of 1948, 1949. Everyone knows about the crisis in Berlin in 1961. That resulted in the wall going up. Not too many people know about what happened in June 1953. So, in a nutshell, I'm just going to borrow some books here. 16th of June 1953. Construction workers in the Stalin Alley in East Berlin. So what was going on there? There was a massive construction program was underway that was effectively transforming the streets into a Stalinist memorial. Now the construction workers, went on strike against new increased work norms. So they weren't being treated properly, they weren't being paid properly, they were working too long hours, all of those type of things. So they went out to, first of all, they began to protest at the trade union headquarters in Berlin, East Berlin. No one from the SED leadership came out to meet the protesters or to listen to their demands. Okay. And so from the trade union offices, they moved on to the main government buildings where the government ministries are housed. There were some conflicting messages as to whether the new working norms would be abandoned. One minister promised that the new working norms would be abandoned. Another Politburo minister said they would be, quote unquote, reconsidered. And so, of course, the crowd became increasingly dejected and restless. And there were calls for the resignation of the SED leadership. More political freedoms, better working conditions, more consumer goods. So, all the things that people are frustrated with living under a communist regime. There are no prospects. The working hours are long. Workers are given impossible quotas, impossible targets, and there are very little rewards or very little prospect of any kind of future in that system. So all of those frustrations came to the boil. So Walter Ulbricht was forced to back down on these new working norms. And his position is very vulnerable here because there's a suspicion, of course, in Moscow that the SED leadership is compromised, that it's weak, that it's the GDR, being, of course, the most important of the satellite states, because it is the dividing line between East and West. So there was a suspicion in the leadership in the USSR that Ulbricht had lost control of the situation. And of course, the end result was that the Soviet Union sent in 20,000 Soviet troops, along with tanks, along with 8,000 police, GDR police, to crush the uprising. As you would imagine, there was some pretty fierce fighting. and around somewhere in the region of 50 to 130 people had lost their lives. Okay. Now, all of this, of course, Stalin had died, so there was this, a little bit of a relaxation, perhaps, of Sovietisation in East Germany, and that, along with perhaps a renewed sense of now the Stalinist yoke is withering away, that the GDR perhaps might be able to, pursue its own path to socialism, and that probably gave the workers a bit more confidence that the uprising would not be dealt with in such a heavy-handed way, but of course it was. Now, overall, this was kind of a validation for Walter Ulbricht, who had been reluctant to introduce the type of reforms, the type of Sovietisation that the Soviet leadership were actually requiring in the GDR. And the events at the uprising kind of showed that he was correct in that assessment. Ulbricht survived. Politically, he survived. And that justified, of course, a halting, slowing down of the reforms, and then, of course, a mass crackdown on the dissidents involved. So around 6,000 people were arrested. So the Stasi really, went into overtime, tracking down the ringleaders of the uprising. So around 6,000 people were arrested in the following months, of course, and that also led to a big clear out of the government bureaucracy and the civil service. So there was a mass purge of the SED that Ulbricht was able to institute in the wake of the uprising. It did lead to a reform of the Stasi, and what we see in the wake of that is a more efficient and a more ruthless Ministry of State Security. And overall, what we see is Ulbricht consolidating his position within the GDR. Okay. And really being able to put his particular stamp on the GDR, rather than it being simply a kind of a mouthpiece or a puppet of Moscow. So that concludes the first podcast for Unit 2T. So obviously we've looked at the scale of Sovietisation in the GDR. And I think what we can say overall is that the GDR as a political entity is really secure and healthy by 1964 in the wake of the building of the Berlin Wall. How far was it a creature of Moscow? That's debatable, given that the reforms that Moscow were encouraging the GDR to make was probably, pensions and better working conditions, etc., was probably a cause of the uprising of 1953. And it's the uprising of 1953 that allows Ulbricht to put his stamp on the GDR. So the GDR starts off life very much as a creature of Moscow, but I would suggest that by 1964, it has a high degree of autonomy, and Walter Ulbricht has really put his stamp on it, so to speak. Okay, I hope that helps. See you in the next podcast.